There
Hello,
we go.
friends. I'm John Oakes. I'm a chemistry and physics professor for about 34 years who went into the ministry about 2 years ago. Question about what is truth, in a postmodern world. What's the basis for morality? What's the basis for right action? Things like that. The way I see it is our culture has become largely secularized, and whether that's good or bad, it's a debatable thing. But I believe there's been a loss of a sense of morality in our culture. There's a sense of the loss of God being relevant. And I also believe that there's been a loss of the intellectual high ground for Christians, for us as believers. I think we've been intimidated into the background by modernism, by postmodernism, by Islam, by Eastern religion, by pantheism. So I want to argue for the Christian worldview in this talk and also discuss other worldviews. I want to do it in a respectful tone. I don't want to, engage in some of the angry rhetoric, but really I want to have a reasonable discussion about Christian worldview. So let's talk about worldview itself. Some of the important worldviews that are going to be mentioned in this class are naturalism or materialism, postmodernism, pantheism, Eastern religions, and kind of the New Age kind of thinking. I'll talk about Islam really briefly, and then I want to talk about, obviously, Christian theism, that worldview. And so let's talk a little bit about worldview. Worldview is the perspective one uses to process and interpret information received about the world. In other words, we are not just a neutral blank slate, as John Locke would say. We're not simply receiving information and turning that information into ideas. That our worldview is the lens through which we interpret what we see. James Sire, who wrote my favorite book on worldview, The Universe Next Door, said a worldview is a set of presuppositions or assumptions, if you will, that we hold about the basic makeup of the world. And so I want to talk about different possible worldviews, but first I want to give my own little version of what would make a worldview a good one. Number one, it needs to be true. In other words, if the basic assumptions you make about the universe, about reality, are not true, that's problematic. So we're going to hold modernism, postmodernism, Christian worldview, and other worldviews up to this lens of, is it consistent? When I say true, what I mean is consistent with what we know about reality. Number two, does it successfully answer the questions that people actually care about? And number three, can we reasonably conclude that accepting this worldview would make somebody a good person? You think, we're talking about good person. That's very subjective. I believe you could put a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, an atheist, and well, I don't know if there's such a thing as a postmodernist, but put people with those philosophies in a room and ask them to come up with a list of what would make a good person. And I believe that would be a pretty easy exercise, actually. And I think they come to consensus pretty quickly. So we can look at a worldview to ask, can we reasonably believe accepting this worldview would create a, in quotes, good person? So I'm going to look at about 5 different worldviews in, oh my goodness, about 40, 45 minutes, hopefully. And we're going to ask those questions of those worldviews. Okay, got it? So some of the questions that we want to answer is, what is a person? What is our very nature? What happens when we die? What is our purpose, if any? What value do we have? How do we know what's right and wrong? And what is our relationship with the prime reality, if there is one? Okay? Now, first I want to talk briefly about scientism or materialism. It's the belief that the only reliable, valid instrument for deciding truth is or even the value of any proposition is the scientific method. All right, and so this becomes the only decider whether something's true, which is whether it's consistent with things we can observe directly through instruments. A statement of materialism is from Richard Lewontin. We exist as material beings in a material world, all of whose phenomena are the consequences of material relations among material entities. In a word, the public needs to accept materialism, which means they must put God in the trash can of history where such myths belong. Now, this materialism, which is associated with modernism, if you will, but not necessarily, this is the kind of the worldview in which I swim as a scientist. And so I want to talk about that. And I believe at the universities, you'll come across a lot of people who take this worldview and they sort of laugh really, any worldview that accepts anything other than this. And they come across as if you don't agree with them, you're some sort of an idiot. But I think this worldview deserves a little bit of attention and ask a few questions. Richard Dawkins gave another statement, who wrote The God Delusion. In the universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason, no justice. And he's using important words here that explains what's really going on with materialism. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we'd expect if there's no design, no purpose. Remember some of those questions? What is the purpose? There is none. No evil and no good. Remember, that's another one of the questions. What is right and what is wrong? He's saying there is no answer to those questions. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares, knows nor cares. It is, and we dance to its music. I'm going to skip that slide. Now, I'm going to respond to this based on whether it's true, whether it answers the questions we really care about, and whether or not accepting this worldview would make us a better person. I'm going to claim that it's essentially a religious belief based on circular reasoning without any actual support. That's to the correctness of this worldview. I'm going to claim it doesn't answer the questions that people actually care about at all. It completely, utterly fails. I'm going to claim it's just plain not true. It is just a false worldview, not consistent with reality. And also that it's a dangerous worldview that does not make a better person. There's a show on BBC a few. Basically, it's like intellectuals on trial. They brought in a theist and then an atheist who's defending this worldview. And so basically the idea is there's a panel, they ask questions, and then they respond. So they asked him to make an opening statement. He said, the only thing that is real in the universe is things that can be measured, that only the scientific method is a means to acquire truth. And then one of the panelists asked him, well, how do you know that? He said, well, all these other religions and fundamentalism, blah, 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 crusades, blah, blah, blah. And they interrupted him and they said, sir, we asked you a question. How do you know that this worldview is correct? And he said, all these religious people, they do so many bad things. And then the panelist stopped him one more time. He said, sir, we asked you a question. You either answer it or we're going to bring in the next person. How do you know that this worldview is true? And he said, well, I guess I just believe it. And it's interesting. Materialists don't recognize that they have no basis for this being true. In other words, they assume it's true and they move forward on that assumption. Well, that's not a very good reason to believe that something is true. The modernism doesn't answer the questions we care about. Now, science is great. I teach a philosophy of science course. I used to anyway, don't anymore. I'm teaching the Bible now. But I talk about the nature of science, and I tell my students that science is great. Materialism is great at answering questions like when, what, where, how many, by what means. But then I ask them, do you actually care about those questions? Is that something you, in your heart of hearts? No, nobody cares about those. I mean, thank you, science, for answering those questions, and they're helpful towards technology, towards economics, towards explaining kind of how the physical universe works. But science sucks, if I can say it that way, at answering questions, why am I here? What is my value? What is the right thing to do? Does God exist? Science, by the way, is useless. Materialism is useless at answering this basic question, does God exist? Materialism says no. How do you know that? Because by definition, he does not. Will God listen if I pray? Why am I here? According to science, remember Dawkins said, just random chance. It's just a complete accident. You have no purpose. If you have any purpose at all, it's to create as many copies of your DNA as possible, which could justify all kinds of really evil activities if you think about it. If materialism is right, then I don't exist. What I mean is, I say, I want to go to the store. Well, that doesn't even mean anything. Because if materialism is right, all I am is a sack of chemicals and neurons firing, and it's all deterministic. What I do and what I think is determined not by any moral sense, but by just chemical reactions and the connections of neurons in the brain. If materialism is right, then life has no value. But I disagree with that, and that we have no purpose. And again, I believe that's not true. And if materialism is true, then love is a meaningless word. It's just neurotransmitters being released in the brain and things like that. What a depressing worldview if it were true, but it's not true. It's patently false. It assumes that the universe has no cause, and yet the universe came into existence from nothing. If materialism is right, then art and literature have no intrinsic value. Justice is a meaningless word. Well, what is justice? And if materialism is true, then human rights have no basis, no philosophical basis. Scientism or materialism is false because the universe was created, life was created. There is right and wrong. I don't care what you say. It is wrong to murder, to commit sexual assault. Genocide is just plain bad. Also, by the way, because the Bible is inspired by God. If materialism is right, then good and evil are meaningless ideas. We have no purpose. Any kind of sexual behavior is as good as any other. Racism and slavery can be defended because there's no moral reason to say that they're bad or not acceptable. No wonder intellectuals overreacted, in a sense, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that produced another worldview, postmodernism. Now, I'm a modernist by background because I was born in the 50s. The audience to this talk are postmodern. And by the way, I'm not against postmodernism per se. In fact, I think postmodernism is a preferable approach to thinking about the nature of things. I'm not a committed modernist, although I tend to view the world that way. But postmodernism says truth, if it exists at all, is contained in culture. Bottom line is there's no absolute truth. It's true for you, but it's not true for me. And this is a very confusing worldview. And in this worldview, there's no moral compass. There's no moral absolute. There's no absolute truth. But by the way, again, I'm not here to put down your background, which, by the way, I find preferable in many ways to my own. Postmodernism has done good things for culture, for history. It recognizes the importance of groups. It recognizes that the Western perspective is not the only one or even the best one. It gives honor to culture, beauty, wonder, imagination, narrative. And the materialist worldview just looks for facts and information. Postmodernism has a lot to offer. But essentially, as a worldview, it's the worldviewless worldview. Very confusing. It says, theism, that's good if you believe it. Pantheism, atheism, they're all equally good. Well, what does that even mean? The idea of truth disappears. Reality is a social construction. Truth is true for you, it's not true for me, and that's just perfectly okay. Meaning is determined by the community that accepts it. And if everybody accepts that gravity is not real, then I guess it's not real. If it's true, then there's no rational way to discover which is the best worldview. If postmodernism is correct, then science doesn't know what it's talking about, but science does appear to discover truth about the physical universe. It's self-refuting. You say there's no absolute truth. Are you absolutely sure that there's no absolute truth? And the answer is absolutely. Well, there you go. And I don't care what anybody says, some things are just true. It is just plain wrong to murder, to engage in sexual relationships with the same gender. It's wrong to steal and to lie. I believe there is moral truth. Either God exists or he doesn't. And what we think about that, our perspective on that doesn't change it. The postmodern world view tends to demote the hero or the social crusader as dangerous, as opposing certain viewpoints, rather than accepting that everything's true. Postmodernism I believe is not a good worldview. It doesn't agree with reality. It doesn't agree as the world as it is, because the world tells us that there are certain things that are just plain true. Electrons exist. I don't care what you say. Truth is not relative. I believe it can be dangerous, not as an approach to culture, even to history, but as an approach to the world itself. Because which is the better culture? The Nazi culture? And sin, by the way, is not determined by culture. It's determined by the creator himself. And again, if you go for the postmodern worldview, then crusaders such as Buddha or Nelson Mandela or Jesus, they're downright dangerous because they're telling us that some things are just plain wrong. All right, now the next time I want to talk about the Christian worldview. That's what we're here to do, right? We're here primarily to discuss the Christian worldview. So let me talk about that just a little bit. In fact, don't look at the slide. In fact, let me just go back. A good thing to do would ask yourself, what essentially is the Christian worldview? What are those basic propositions about truth? I believe you could establish the Christian worldview simply by reading Genesis 1 through 3. All the things I'm going to put up on the next slide. And by the way, the Christian worldview is not about doctrine. Arguably, it's not even about theology. The Christian worldview essentially says, what is true? How does the universe ultimately work? All right? I've already shown that the postmodern worldview is not true. It's confusing. It doesn't create people who are essentially a better person because it doesn't determine between right and wrong. I've shown that that materialism or the scientific worldview, if it is a worldview, I'm a scientist, but science is not my worldview. The scientific worldview is downright dangerous. A world in which there is no moral truth or justice is a world that I don't want to live in. But what about the Christian worldview? What are the basic statements about reality? Now, I'm going to read through this quickly and not take a lot of time. This will be available at my website. Probably it'll be available through the Worldview Conference somehow, this PowerPoint, because I think you need to spend some time thinking about this. But I believe if you look at Genesis 1 through 3, this essentially is the description of reality from the biblical perspective. First of all, the physical world is real. Materialism agrees with that. It was created, and it is good. This is important. So according to Christian theism, as opposed to pantheism, we'll see in a little while, the physical world is real. It was created from nothing, and it's good. According to the Christian worldview, there exists a parallel reality to the physical world, which is a spiritual reality, which is not defined by physical things. The creator of both physical and spiritual things is the God of the Bible. Human beings are both physical and spiritual, and we were created by that God. And this is point number 5 here is important. Although all creation is good, it's all good, as they say, correct? Evil exists, and the question of evil is one of the hardest questions for worldviews to work with. Postmodernism says evil. It's evil for you, but it's not evil for me. Materialism says there is no such thing as evil. The Christian worldview accepts the reality of evil, and it proposes that evil is created because the creator gave human beings free will and choice. Why? Because he loves us. Because God loves us, he put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden because he had to give us a choice. We rebelled. We brought sin into the world. We brought evil into the world. We brought suffering into the world, not all suffering, but certain kinds of suffering. So this point number 5 explains the nature of evil. It explains the cause of suffering. And it's really a linchpin to the Christian worldview. And point number 5 in this outline is completely rejected by all other worldviews other than possibly the Islamic worldview. All right, and number 6, there's a definite right and wrong determined by the creator, by God. And by the way, I could say point 7, which has to do with the solution for evil, which is part of that, which is, Christ, obviously. Now, I believe the Christian worldview is true. In other words, number one, the universe is real. Pantheism denies that. Buddhism and Hinduism, their cosmology designs the reality, ultimate reality of physical things, that they're essentially an illusion. I believe creation is good. The Christian explanation of creation is the correct one. That creation has never been the problem. It's been rebellion and sin. The problems in the world are not coming from God, but from his creation, from the creation that he gave free choice to. And I believe that evil is real. The other worldviews we're going to discuss, other than Islam, which, by the way, does agree evil is real, the other worldviews deny the reality, essential reality of evil. Well, there's a problem, because if you don't believe that evil is real, then that gives a lot more room for evil, does it not? And by the way, despite what naturalists say, I exist. I am a self-aware person. I exist. Although I have a body, I am not a body. God made us physical, and the physical is good, and the fact that we have a body is a good thing. But I would challenge some of the world's views by asking the simple question, do you have a body or are you a body? The naturalist worldview says you are a body. I say I have a body. This is my hand. This is not me. This is my hand. And this self-awareness is something that is given to us as a gift by God. Consciousness is not just some sort of epiphenomena, as the materialist worldview would say. And by the way, science and the Christian worldview do not contradict. In fact, I don't have time for this, but I can show from history and look at Roger Bacon and others that essentially science itself was created directly out of the Christian worldview, which sees a single set of laws governing the universe because there's one God that governs the universe, etc. Christian worldview is the only one that answers with full, utter satisfaction those basic questions. How did I get here? We'll talk about the Eastern worldviews in a bit. The way I got here is because God made me. Why? Because he loves me. Why am I here? Because God wants to love me. He wants me to love him, and he wants us to love one another. That's the reason we exist. Where am I going? Well, we are eternal. Our nature is eternal. What is our purpose? Our purpose is to give glory to God. Other things like, why is it that human beings can understand the universe? Because God made us in order to be able to understand the universe. Why is there pain and suffering? I don't have time for that. That's another lesson. Go to my website. You can find a lesson on that. Why is there evil in the world? Because God loved us so much that he gave us the ability essentially to disobey him. You know, we're going to look at the idea of purpose and value in Islam and in Eastern worldview, but in materialism, we have no essential value at all. Christianity offers solutions to the most basic, fundamental questions that every human being cares about. The problem of sin, the problem of suffering, the problem of death. What does postmodernism do to help you with suffering or with death or sin? The Christian worldview is true. The universe was created. There is a separate spirituality. Those points are consistent with every single thing I know about reality. The Christian worldview answers the questions that we care about. But very importantly, I believe the Christian worldview is the one that creates better people if it's accepted as the worldview. If it weren't for the Christian worldview, we would not have science. If I believe, and I would defend this against all comers, that if it were not for Christianity, slavery would be endemic to the world. If it were not for the Christian worldview, the idea of civil rights would not have been created, and women's rights as well. And I'll have you notice, it's not an accident that Christian groups do a significant majority of the benevolent work around the world, because the Christian worldview says compassion is the correct response to suffering. Okay? Now, again, I'm having to do a pretty quick treatment of all these things because I want this lesson to end in about 40 minutes. But just briefly here, we've discussed naturalism as a worldview. I believe I've shown, although more could have been said, that naturalism or materialism simply is not a correct view. There is a spirituality. Evil is real, and we have value. We have purpose. It doesn't answer the questions that we really care about, and it certainly does not create good people. Because, naturalism has been tried as a worldview in certain cultures. Soviet Russia, Pol Pot Cambodia, North Korea, Red China, and arguably a French Revolution. Not a good result from that experiment. Postmodernism is okay as a way of thought to think about culture, to think about history, to think about art and music. Beautiful. I love postmodernism. It's much better than modernism for those questions. But as a worldview, it's the worldview that is worldviewless. It's confusing. So we cannot hang on to your postmodern perspective in order to ask the basic questions about reality. And don't forget that. Okay, deism, I'm not going to have time for deism, animism, dualism, I don't have time for those. I would say this, though, if Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is true, then naturalism is false, postmodernism is false, deism is false, pantheism is false, dualism is false. All those are left in the dust. Now, you could ask whether Genesis 1 and 2 are true in the cosmological, theological worldview sense. All right, and I believe they are. The whole literal interpretation, that's a whole other story. All right, so the one I want to talk about now, in the time I have left, I want to talk about pantheism. I also want to talk about Islam, the Islamic worldview. And by the way, just so you know, the Islamic worldview falls under theism. It may not be biblical theism, but it is a theistic worldview. So the Islamic worldview is the one, part of the closest cousin, if you will, to the Christian worldview. Let's just tell it like it is. All right. So anyway, so I want to talk about pantheism. Here we go. I was mentioning this. If Genesis 1:1 is true, then animism, polytheism, pantheism, dualism, naturalism, maybe deism, postmodernism, every other ism is proof false. So then you have to go back and ask, is it true that there was a beginning, that God was in the beginning, that God created the heavens and the earth? Is it true? And if it's true, then these other worldviews are simply not true. And conflicting worldviews can't both be true at the same time. By the way, I'm going to talk about the Eastern worldview, but I want to very, very briefly look at Acts 17. I don't have time to analyze it thoroughly, but if you go to Acts 17, here Paul is giving a worldview argument in the midst of Epicureans and Stoics who believe that God is, they're kind of deism or pantheism. The Stoics are deists, the Epicureans are pantheists and atheists. And basically what he does is he finds common ground. As in discussing worldview with people, I want to suggest you find a common ground. We have common ground with naturalists. We have common ground with Muslims. Find a common ground on things that we agree are essentially true, that work. And so that's what he does. He says, I see all these idols, and there's a bunch of nonsense. The Epicureans and Stoics are with him on that all together, He says, I see there's even a shrine to the unknown God. How ridiculous is that? He doesn't call it ridiculous. Don't use that word when you're discussing worldview. But we're with you on that, Paul. But he says, you know what? I want to tell you about a better God. I want to tell you about a God in whom we live and move and have our being. He is close to us. He knows us. He wants to be known. And notice when Paul discusses this, he quotes Aretas, a Stoic philosopher. He quotes an Epicurean. He knows their worldview better than they know their worldview on some level. So I want to suggest that one of the results of this little conversation we're having here is that you dive into these other worldviews and ask the kind of questions I'm asking here. Is it true? Does it answer the questions we really care about? And can we reasonably conclude that it'll make us a better person for having accepted it as our worldview? So basically, again, I don't have time to analyze Acts 17, but Acts 17 is essentially a worldview argument made by this amazing person, Paul. And after this worldview argument, in which he finds common ground, and then he does a comparative worldview, and he argues for the Christian world being a superior one. Notice, some sneered, others, a small percentage, accepted and became Christians. So he argues for the superiority of and the truth of the Christian worldview, as opposed to the Epicurean, which is pantheism, and the deism of Stoicism. He quotes their philosopher, and he points them, after having a worldview discussion, then he points them to Jesus, which is interesting. Because I'm telling you, we live in the post-Christian age. I assume, by the way, my generation, they haven't figured this out yet. Your generation has figured out that we're living in a post-Christian age. And that's okay. Because the church in the first century was definitely a pre-Christian age. And man, they conquered the Roman Empire. Don't be intimidated by these other worldviews, because ours is right. It provides the answers that everyone you know are looking for. And I'm telling you, it'll make you a better person. Absolutely. Like I said, some but not all were converted. Now I want to talk about, just real briefly, about the Hindu worldview. It sees the physical world as being an illusion. The word there would be Maya. Suffering and evil also are not inherently real. It's pantheistic, so there's this universal soul, which is not separate from the universe, is part of the universe, which is why, according to Hinduism, the Hindu cosmology is that the universe is eternal. Because if God in the universe are coexistent, then God cannot have created the universe. That would mean he created himself. Well, let's stop right there. We know from science that all the evidence points towards the Big Bang and towards a created universe. So we know, therefore, Hinduism, it's not true. I don't be mean about it, but the basic assumption of Hinduism requires an eternal universe. Essentially, the cosmology of Hinduism is this cycle of creation and Shiva and Vishnu and Brahma and creations being upheld and then destroyed. Shiva, destroyer, Brahman, creator, Vishnu, sustainer, the sort of the trinity, if you will, of Hinduism. But the problem with that is, it's not true. I don't want to be obnoxious about it. So according to the Hindu worldview, when we die, our soul is a very different concept. Our soul is swallowed up in Brahman. The purpose of human life, according to Hinduism, is to essentially cease to exist, to be absorbed into the universal reality. Okay, if that were true, I guess we'd have to accept it. But to me, that's not such a great thing. Individuals do not have value in this worldview, not inherent value. They might have provisional value, but not inherent value. Because essentially, we are God, everything is God, and we don't, our individual existence is really a temporary thing, and it's not even an ultimately real thing. It's the goal, the purpose, if you will, of Hinduism is to escape reality and essentially to stop existing, to be dissolved into the infinite. And nirvana then is achievement of oneness with this God that's in you. And I'm telling you, according to Hinduism, you are God. And I personally believe actually that I am not God. The Hindu worldview has human beings looking inward. The Christian worldview has people looking outward. Okay? Now that's a very ridiculously short summary of the Hindu worldview. It ignores the polytheism in Hinduism and other things. Is it true? Is Hindu cosmology with this eternal universe and this cyclic creation, destruction, renewal, creation, is it true? The answer is, it is not true. Hinduism is not true. Contrary to Hindu ideas, the physical world is real and it's good. To the extent that Hinduism even accepts the reality of physical things, it says that those things are evil. And by the way, it says that suffering is an illusion and evil is an illusion, ultimately. And I don't agree with that at all. Does it answer the important questions? I'll say it does a lot better than modernism or postmodernism. It does agree that there is a kind of a morality. There is right and wrong. But so it does better there. But the question of value, the question of purpose, these are very unsatisfactory answers. Does this worldview make one better than one would have been otherwise if one held to another worldview? Better than a modernist or a materialist, excuse me, not a modernist, I'm a modernist. Better than a materialist or a person who accepts the materialist worldview. Better than a postmodernist, arguably, I guess. I don't know about that. But, you know, it's interesting. Who does the majority of benevolent works in Hindu countries? The answer is Christians. Because the Hindu worldview says these problems are not real. All right? Suffering is not real and evil is not real. So, no, there's some nice and good people, I guess, that are Hindus, but ultimately, I would very, very strongly hold the Christian worldview against the Hindu worldview in simply the question, does it make a better person than one otherwise would have been? Okay, we could talk about Buddhism. The theology of Buddhism is a little bit confusing. Siddhartha didn't really want to discuss theology necessarily. There's the Four Noble Truths. Suffering is not getting what you want. The cause of suffering is desire. The way to end suffering is to end desire. The way to the end of desire is the Eightfold Path. I think I took the slide. Oh, they're there. There's the Eightfold Path, right viewpoint, right values, right speech. It's essentially, as a ethical system, Buddhism is something I find attractive, actually. But it's essentially pantheism. And although Buddha didn't really directly describe his worldview as pantheistic, it is. And therefore, Buddhism has the world being eternal. There's these cycles of creation, destruction. Whether it's pantheist or agnostic is maybe debatable, but in Buddhism, the physical world is an illusion. It's not good. Suffering is an illusion. We have reincarnation, this cyclic cosmology. The goal, like Hinduism, because it essentially is a pantheistic religion, is to lose oneself. So we focus in on our belly buttons so that we sort of it's a worldview that is dispassionate, as opposed to a Christian worldview, which is essentially compassionate. Got it? All right. Is the Buddhist worldview a good one? Is it true? Is the world really just an illusion? Its cosmology has been thoroughly refuted by science. Its ability to answer the questions that people really care about is superior to the first two worldviews. But I believe that the question of value and purpose, it does a lousy job because it says the individual doesn't matter. Does it make a better person? Well, probably better than the most modernist, the materialist, and I won't get into the whole Hinduism versus Buddhism. I prefer Buddhism, actually, but ultimately, I believe Christianity gave us science. It gave us civil rights. It gave us women's rights. It gave us dignity of human beings. It deals with the question of all these things. Christianity is much better if it's a worldview that's accepted and applied than the Buddhist worldview. Islamic theology, surely good deeds take away evil deeds, salvation by your own effort, charity atones for sin, we earn grace, we earn favor of Allah. All right, again, it is a theistic worldview. It accepts the idea that the universe was in fact created by God. All right, it accepts there is a physical and a spiritual reality. You know, sometimes your closest cousin is the one you don't get along with so well. Look at the Middle East. So the Islamic worldview has much to defend it in terms of point number one, is it true? Now, in terms of answering the questions about value and worth and making us a better person, there I think is where the Islamic worldview is problematic. Because in Islam, salvation is earned through the efforts of those who are pre-selected by a deterministic God, Allah, to inhabit a central paradise. There's this inshallah, God wills it. The idea that God's will, it's a little bit like Calvinistic predestination is more what Islam is like. Who reaches out to whom? The Christian worldview is the only theistic worldview that has God reaching out to us rather than our reaching up and striving to become like God through our own efforts. So the human approach of the basic all human created religions are mankind reaching out to God. Christian theism says God is reaching out to people, and God became flesh and dwelt among us. All right, in Islam, salvation is earned through the efforts of those who are pre-selected by Allah to inhabit a central paradise. In Christianity, salvation is granted by the grace of the loving God, for those who through faith and repentance and baptism accept that love. Is it true? Well, is Muhammad really a prophet? We could talk about his wives, the massacres, all those things, abrogation, science and historical errors. Does it make its followers better? I would say overall, yes, compared to many worldviews. However, in Islam, lying is not a major sin. And besides, one of the pillars of Islam is almsgiving, which is a good thing. A majority of benevolent works in Muslim countries are done by Muslims. That's a good thing. But in Islam, it's essentially against the law, against their Quran, to do good deeds and to help people outside of Islam. Unless all of the problems within Islam are solved, that they're not allowed to go out and help other people. So I would say, no, it's not a better worldview. So in summary, the theologies where religions are fundamentally and diametrically opposed to one another, you've got to choose. And as William Sarr would tell you, you have a worldview even if you say you don't. The worldview of Christianity is radically different from any other worldview. Arguably, other than Islam, the Christian worldview is true. It's confirmed by science. It's confirmed by history. It's confirmed by evidence, internal evidence from prophecy, fulfillment, and all that. It provides amazing, wonderful, fantastic answers, very satisfying answers to those basic questions. And I believe it is by far the worldview that creates the best kind of person, even from an independent perspective. Okay, now, again, I want to apologize that I had to do this recording. Your class is happening when church is happening in Bakersfield. But I'm pretty sure the plan is this, that I will be there immediately after this lesson in our, whatever the thing we have here, so I can take questions.